Eastmouth. Here we are again, taking part in another grand cycle, it would seem. A little dash of growth and then a storm of decay. Somehow it always stems from right here, our own little piece of heaven. You want to hear a joke, folks? No one's listening. That's the joke of the hour. Real funny, right? What am I even doing? I suppose all of that philosophical nonsense is beside the point. I wouldn't be doing this, talking to dead air, if I didn't think there to be a purpose for it. I suppose I'm doing this to leave behind an account of these strange days, and hopefully to get through to somebody. Nobody in this town seems to notice they're being lined up on a cliff. What's to stop someone from merely pushing them off? I'm here in an attempt to give another side of the story. A side that doesn't correspond with the one that the town council wants you to hear. A side that doesn't just ignore the strange departures of townsfolk or rumors of illegal happenings concerning our very own government figures. As such, you can call me Solomon. I'll be your host, sitting comfortably in my temple, and keeping you up to date on all the strange rumors and dangerous happenings. So, good citizens, curl up nice and cozy, lock your doors, keep a shotgun handy, and open your earwaves for tonight's riveting story. It'll be sure to trap your attention.
The Eastmouth podcast is written, directed, and narrated by DC Tullis. Based on the world created by DC and JD Tullis.
I'll start this by saying it's the first time I've ever been on air. It's the 60s, so my dreams of radio are not uncommon. But this isn't quite like that. I've actually got a story to tell. Let me start with the mysterious letter that I received today. It showed up at the temple. Without me even being aware that there were others who knew of its location. It's all a bit mysterious. Maybe not in the way that the multiplex would have you believe. No daring secret agents dressed in black dropping off suitcases. At least as far as I'm aware. Rather, I'd actually fallen asleep. Broad daylight, sitting in my ratty chair, and I woke to find that somebody had slid a thick envelope through the door. It was anonymous, as is to be expected from the lengths the author took to conceal their own identity. Whoever had left them here had bugged out real quick. They failed to leave any visible footprints either, despite the muddy ground. It was a surprise at first to realize that somebody else knew the exact location of this place. It's in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by... well, I wouldn't want to reveal too much. Nonetheless, the encounter gave me quite a spook. I thank you for that, mystery author. I don't know, maybe I'm a bit too curious for my own good. Scratch that. I did what anyone else would. I opened the jammed envelope and I began to read. And I almost want to be entirely upfront about the contents, but I think I'd rather read it all to you instead. I mean, what's the point of resurrecting this old radio equipment otherwise? So, I say that I say that we ought to give it a shot. You can call me Solomon, and this is not your nightly news broadcast. I've been an employee of the Eastmouth Public Library for the last few years. Enough time to get acquainted with my surroundings, at least. It's an uncomfortable place. There's the strange sensation of being watched at certain times of the night, which I used to chalk up to nerves. And there's the oddly confectionery scent that leaks from the pipes in the boiler room. Yet, the rest of the library appears to be no different from any other. You might then ask why I would even mention such things. Ivy runs through the exterior and interior of the building. That ivy infects the upper management the most. They collude in secret when they're not being cruel to their very own staff. There's an awful lot of mulling about with their late-night meetings. My preference towards being employed always put me off of snooping on them. Not to mention that I get the heebie-jeebies even thinking about it. And so I did the job that I was paid for and kept my head away from the shadows. That had been my plan, at least, until they fired my pal. I'd grown up with him. Family cookouts, weekends diving off of the dock, exploring the woodlands by Preacher's Rock. And then, out of nowhere, he was gone. All that was left of him was a note that showed up in my mailbox. There was no return address, much like this letter, if I ever work up the nerve to even send it. Yet, the writing clearly wasn't him. It was too professional, lacking his unusual choice of words. The letter claimed that he was sorry for his sudden departure, but he'd taken up work as a traveling salesman on the other side of Maine. That he planned to visit in a year or two. He didn't tell me anything himself, and then he was just gone. It took me a while to piece together what I wanted to do after that. I spent some very long nights, sat on my thoughts till I couldn't bear them any longer. Upper management. I've never met anyone higher in the food chain than my own boss. But I knew that there was a calendar on the 3rd floor of the library. It had a meeting schedule right next to these 2 doors that always seemed to be locked up real tight. There was a glass panel in each of them. It would have been prime for spying, but there was a bit of a catch. A curtain had been specially installed behind each of those windows a year prior. Sure, everybody thought that it was strange, but I was the kook for thinking it truly peculiar. I quickly learned to shut my trap about my pal's vanishing act as well. Nobody seemed to care all too much, and I knew I mustn't raise suspicion. I had the feeling it wouldn't end too well if I did. Solomon here with an interjection. Did you, anonymous writer of the letters, by chance insult his wife, his faith, or the Beach Boys? All happen to be perfectly swell reasons to disappear. It was my second attempt at breaking in and eavesdropping. A late Wednesday towards the end of March. Torrents of rain fell from the heavens, and I was hoping that tonight would be different from my previous attempt at an investigation. So far, all I'd gathered was idle small talk and discussions too unimportant for the average town council meeting. I'd clocked out with my coworkers, but shot down their offer to visit the Lorelei for a few drinks. I can only pray that my refusal did not seem too anxious. I told them that I had to take care of my dog, who had been feeling unwell. I've never had a dog. A fact that I must have mentioned prior, as I received at least one odd look. Nonetheless, I got an understanding pat on the back, and my coworkers headed to their cars. Ah, conveniently enough, it's now raining outside of the temple. All for the best, if you ask me, folks. It only adds to the atmosphere. I'll stop cutting in for now. Back to the story. My Ford was parked in the darkest and farthest corner of the lot. It was hidden beneath the branches of a great oak tree. And so I'd waited. I'd waited real patient-like. The sort of careful, lights off, head down kind of waiting. About an hour after the library had been closed, which must have been around 11 o'clock, 3 cars all pulled up in nearly a line. Fancy cars, too. The kind that you see on the screen at a drive-in. The kind that distracts you from your date and fills you with just a tad bit of envy. That kind of car. I'd waited nearly 10 minutes, just to be sure that they weren't lounging around, gabbing it up, waiting for some foolhardy librarian to come in and disturb them. Finally, I left my car, creeping slowly towards the lobby like I was some kind of raccoon. The doors were locked, which wasn't particularly surprising. They must have relocked them after entering. Luckily, I had a set of keys. I'd opened one of the doors and slowly began to make my way through the lower lobby, towards the farthest end of the building. Beyond the tattered blue couches and the endless aisles of unread paperbacks. It was closing in, skulking nearer and nearer to the stairwell door. The floor seemed to creak with every other step. Upon finally reaching the door to the stairwell, I glanced through the accompanying window and watched as the rain drowned the streets below. I'd parked my car on a decline, and the worsening of the rain only made that more irritating. Despite my annoyance and the potential threat to my alibi, it didn't matter. I was close enough to hear the distant murmur of voices coming from the top floor. I hugged the door and extended an arm around the handle. I gave it a little jiggle and confirmed that it was unlocked. That was the least of my worries, considering that the handle belonged to a series of mountainous doors. With careful pressure, I pulled them back and snuck into a claustrophobic hallway that led to both the sub-basement and the stairwell that led upward. Is it not odd to have a library of this size in a town so small and isolated? Rumors of a gas leak or a failed exhibit had always haunted the second story of the library, but I imagine it was far closer to poor planning and undue optimism that had truly failed it. Solomon, as you, my chosen reader, surely must know, Eastmouth has underwent many an expensive project in the hope that it became a booming town. There were loaded mines and great catch, and yet those mines quickly ran dry, forcing the town to rely almost entirely on tourism and seafood exports. Anywhere else in the country, this may have fared better, but on the farthest edge of Maine, tourism was always an unlikely attraction. The door down to the basement remained open, perpetually stuck on the broken leg of an old chair. There was no long and interesting story to this. Rather, the damned door just had a tendency to lock itself on its own. I made my way to the base of the stairs and cast my ear upwards. Voices came down towards me, and then with each slow step, the voices gradually rose. Muffled as they were, it sounded like a heated discussion had broken out between 4 or 5 people. Without much thought, I'd let go of the steel doors I'd entered from merely a few seconds prior. A spike of adrenaline took me as the door shut with a bang. Frozen, I stood in silence, waiting for a group of hooded figures to rush me. I must have waited there for nearly 2 minutes, expecting the worst. Would they abduct me? Would they kill me? Would I end up just like my friend? Was I just paranoid? Was I so far in a state of delusion that I would be a better fit for a cell in Tharcom rather than a librarian? There was a momentary pause in conversation, a cough, then some sort of ruffling, and then business seemed to continue as usual. I think I dropped to my knees in relief. I hardly noticed my surroundings till an entire minute had passed on my watch. There was no going back now, Solomon. I took those concrete steps, one by one. The librarians tended to avoid going back here if they had a say in the matter, and it showed. The steps were far filthier than I expected. I passed the second floor, which was, of course, entirely devoid of any sources of light, past the halfway step towards the third, and then past the point of no return, growing closer to the door as I did so. The windows were shrouded by a velvet curtain, just as I had assumed, and so I put my ear carefully against the door. New folks would be good for business, wouldn't they? I could use them at the initial speaker was cut off. We have our festivals and our exports. They generate as much as we need. Our interests are best kept away from unnecessary tourism. The original speaker continues. Surely, but there is already a wish for a secondary church within your own community. My interests in additional housing are only secondary. There was a pause between speakers, and then a female voice spoke, one that almost sounded familiar. Conspiring over someone else's land just like that. Is this really how we wish to conduct ourselves, gentlemen? Can we not find a way that is less divisive? A firm voice takes hold of the silence and gives his edict. With a certain up-and-comer in the council, it would be wise to stop her in her tracks. And yet, I understand why such a position is undesirable. It's something that I will think more on before I lay my case to the rest of the council. As for the secondary issue of tonight, I think none will disagree that we must take a united front. It's a silly issue, but there's been an uptick of... I would like to alter the flow of discussion, said the woman cutting in, if that would be permitted. The voice that spoke prior allowed her to make her case. I've been thinking, isn't it time we ought to seal up the chamber? It's a relic, of course, but just having such an odd room in the library invites the possibility of accident. I'd rather forget our foolish forefathers. Silence came again, and it was impossible to distinguish shock from confusion. And why now? Came the second voice. With the removal of... Solomon here. Apparently our anonymous writer has scribbled over the name. Frankly, what's the point of even writing it down then? We don't need the suspicion of the staff, and I'd rather their little club be nothing more than a memory. And how might the staff even stumble upon it? It would be a waste of time to seal it up, the first voice declared. The woman continued. And yet, it is so close to their office. If only a curious soul removed a book. Like any would even touch that shelf, exclaimed the first voice. There's a reason it's stocked with dusty old books on medicine. Quiet, a voice boomed, clearly the leader. I felt myself shrink closer to the ground. I'd heard enough, and began to creep towards the stairs. Finally, after a month's work, they'd confirmed my suspicions and left me with new and worrying information. However, what worried me more was that woman. She spoke as if she knew of my presence, knew that I was curious of my colleague, and guided the conversation towards exactly what I was hoping for. She even sounded familiar. It was a most uncomfortable feeling. I listened a little further before I began my descent down the stairs, careful not to give myself away. Outside of the doors on the first floor, a wave of relief seemed to brush right over me. I glared out into the night, uncertain of what to do with what I'd learned. And yet, as an employee, I knew precisely the section that the woman spoke of. It was uncommon to interact with, as few townsfolk had an interest in medicine, nor did the staff of Angel's View ever seem to need it either. And thus, it was rare to ever have to return a book to that shelf. Still, if there was some sort of secret mechanism, it would have to be well hidden. Gradually, making my way from the stairwell, I'd navigated through the aisles until I found myself staring at it, nestled in the shadows. It was only a brief walk away from the office. 2 shelves stood before me, mostly filled with an extensive selection of Eastern and Western texts on medicine. The topics ranged from acupuncture to bloodletting and anything in between. Thinking on what I'd read as a child, I'd imagined that it would have to be some battered Gothic book like Dracula, or a godforsaken tome sealed by a lock. Such an easy distinction would have made my night easier. Unfortunately, those options were fiction, and this aisle was dry and scientific. Medicine had never been my particular flavor of boredom. There were books discussing pain relievers, silvery little books detailing ancient herbal remedies, entire tomes on the history of medicine, and books on crude practices like electrical impotence cures and urine therapy. I grabbed book after book, just giving it a swift grab, hoping it would be as simple as my fantasy suggested, all the while glancing behind to make sure I was not being watched. It was of no use. There were no books on that shelf that would open anything. I wondered if I'd been duped. Maybe I had. It was absurd that a librarian in his own library would struggle to find a book. I remember slumping down in defeat against the opposing shelf. There was always canned soup and whatever was playing on the radio at home. And yet, ironically as it was, in my near surrender, I spotted a sub-shelf built below the regular shelf. With all the shadows about, it was nearly impossible to notice unless one was crouched down. As I peered into the gloomy space, I noted 5 books, a few even coated in webbing. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, A Tale of Two Cities, the Bible, a beaten carcass of a book titled The Yellow King, and the precise application of trepanation. I had heard of neither of the last 2 despite my occupation, so I reached first for The Yellow King. The dust clung uncomfortably to my fingers, accumulating further and further until I realized that I would only tear the cover if I continued. Beside it sat whatever trepanation was, and so I grabbed it next. I nearly jumped back against the other shelf as the sounds of whirring machinery drew my attention. Beside a window approximately 10 feet to my left, a portion of the wall had lowered like a drawbridge. When the shock left, I made my way silently towards the opening and peered in. The room was entirely lightless. Anxiety began to gradually build, but it could not outweigh my curiosity. And so I stepped into the room. The air was stale, and dust floated through it freely. The sickly sweet scent of the basement pipes had also found their way into the room. I couldn't see a damned thing, and I began to fight against the urge to cough. There was a moment where I pondered what I was doing. I could go back and get a flashlight, but I'd have to rummage through the office, or even possibly return all the way home. If I waited any longer or aroused any more attention, and they closed it off, there would be nothing left. I wanted something, anything, a sliver of information about what these mysterious bastards had done to my friend. A clue, a letter, anything that could provide insight on his sudden relocation. Anything to prove that I didn't risk my neck for nothing. Ashamedly, I must admit, I was biting the fingernails of whichever hand was free. I scrounged around the room, bumping into metal or stone in the process. The room seemed to have been about 15 by 15 feet. It was nearly empty with the exception of a few forgotten shelves and a grimy table in the middle of it. Thunder struck loudly in the distance, tearing across the sky and piercing whatever dungeon I'd discovered. After thoroughly searching, I pulled my hand back from the surface of the table and began scouring the rest of the room. Maybe the shelves held something. Or maybe there was still more to discover. My fingers ran across the cool walls and the empty shelves until they grasped something drier than even the dust on the table. It was some sort of paper, and yet it felt as ancient as papyrus. Clutching it tightly, the dust spread onto my fingertips, eating at the sweat. And then there was the sound of footsteps. I froze, uncertain of what to do. I stood there silently for what must have been 15 seconds. I wondered whether the source of the footsteps would discover me. It was probably as simple as sliding the book back into place. And then what? The brick wall would enclose me like a tomb, surrounded by spiders and dehydration. Only left with the hope that one of my coworkers might stumble upon my cries in the morning. I wasn't ready to star in the cask of Amontillado, and so I dashed towards the opening. Just as my feet took flight, I realized I had been right. Someone had pressed the book back into place. The unseen gears began to whir violently as the gap started to shrink. I was so close, and yet my mad dash forward was halted as my foot caught on one of the legs of the table, sending me stumbling. Narrowly, I regained my balance and lunged at the gap, landing on the raising wall. I thrashed desperately as the light of the library shrunk further every second. Tearing the skin of each hand, I managed to pull my torso, and then my legs through the hole and land square on my stomach on the other side. I raised myself to my feet and limped as quickly as I could to the end of the aisle, desperate to see who had just tried to bury me alive. Who would want to do so? And what was worth going to such lengths to hide in a rural seaside town like Eastmouth? There was no one there. No signs, no sounds. Nothing but the quiet stirring of the fans above my head. I collapsed, panting with nothing gained but an old scrap of paper. And dear listeners, assuming there are any of you, our mysterious writer did escape. At least I hope. Someone else writing his final story and sending it my way would be a truly grotesque fate. It would also make me fear for my own safety. I can only hope that's not the case. There is something here which I must mention, something that adds a bit of validity to the story. Attached to the letter was an old document full of runic markings, I suppose. I'm not really qualified to give a theory about it, so I won't. There is, however, a little note sketched at the bottom of it. Courtesy of a new friend, it reads. Whatever the hell that means. There's also the eye in between two crescent moons. There's no doubt that I, and likely any of you who are listening, have seen it around town at some point. Its meaning is a mystery to me. As for those runes, some almost resemble Latin, others, hell, almost look like hieroglyphs or some kind of nuts sheet music. I'm as lost as the rest of you are. Ah well. On a brighter note, as Solomon, your great and mysterious radio host, Eastmouth, I'll be sure to decipher them. For now, all that I can ask is that you stay tuned. Keep supplying me with mysteries and rumors, and I can keep the citizens of this town up to date on all the weird and groovy happenings. As a final note, folks, just remember something. The skies are growing darker, and there's some blood-curdling rumors about the town council and their dealings. I wouldn't want any of you to miss even a single second of it. This is your host, Solomon, signing off. Sleep tight, Eastmouth. Don't let the sea monsters bite.